what we read against Edina. The Edina kids read.
Okay, Roy, it's being live streamed, so
I know. The Edina read Michelle.
I don't think that is really relevant.
Can you
Edina read Michelle from Potomac's counter interpretation, and that we had learned how to debate theory by responding to that.
Zonal, give me the link, bro. I gotta post it.
Yeah, chat.
Michelle.
People coming to Zoom, or is it just live streamed on YouTube, or both?
Interpretation, and that we had learned how to debate theory. Why is that playing back?
Why is there a lag? That's disgusting.
Oh yeah, there's a lag.
Yeah,
But it's fine. No. All YouTube live streams have like a lag of like 5 seconds, so it's fine.
As long as we.
Zonal, you gotta send me the link, bro.
it's in the chat.
It's in chat.
Where?
The Zoom chat.
Oh, I see it.
Also, George, can you add the Google Sheets that you're flowing onto the
Okay, A21. That's good.
Wait, add the Google Sheets to where?
to the speech doc folder I shared you on?
Oh, the one you shared? Okay.
Yeah. Varnik, are you adding to Insta bio or should I?
You add to Insta bio.
Okay.
I'm pulling it up. I'm trying to find the link. Here, wait, that's the Zoom link.
We're good when y'all are.
I'm good. Is anyone not?
Give us like 5 seconds
Yeah.
to get the links out.
Yeah. All right.
Well, let's give it to like 503, 504, so everyone can join.
I sent the link to a few group chats.
Solid.
The
Roy is so cool. A few group chats.
All right, buddy. You're in the group chats. I sent it to.
Wait, hold on. Let me send it to the Discord.
Oh, Sai, drop it in the debate group thingy.
Oh yeah, that's what I got you.
All the
All the what, Varnica? This is live
Nothing.
stream.
Are we using Eli? Are we using the Eli doc or are we using the theory demos speech docs?
There's a theory demo speech docs.
I have no idea. Let's just use the Eli doc. You want to use the February Eli doc just for the.
Yes, we are. It's Eli Doc V2.
Let me go find it.
VR theory round flow in quotes. That's funny. Okay.
I'm really gonna start my speech with this debate will be in part a debate about.
No, you're not doing that again.
That shit was so funny. Deepak Gupta loved it.
Yeah, but you forgot to say one off then case. Dude, if that had been a prelim and I had been judging you and you forgot to say if you didn't give me a chance to get an extra sheet, that's an auto 26.
That's facts. I really.
Wow,
You
we're
said
getting
like-
26, pretty high.
Oh, with Gavin Sayre in the back, round 7 of TOC, I also forgot to say one off and then case, and I just kind of went into a 1,400 word doc, and Gavin did not look very happy at all.
Dude, that guy's kind of a theory hack though.
He used to be last year. Now he hates theory because, like,
No, he doesn't hate, well, yeah.
he refuses to evaluate RVI arguments. He thinks that if they prove that your method isn't substantively and calculatively better than theirs, you auto lose. So you just have to mop them. Like, it's fine. We'd still read the shell in front of them, but like, you have to win by a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Isn't everyone good now?
Yeah, we're probably good now.
One sec. Sorry, my Google Docs.
Wait,
here.
Zonal, do your little thing.
So, just for everyone watching, so today Nathaniel and Sai will be starting off reading a paraphrase case on the UBI topic, and then Eli and Roy will be reading a off on disclosure or paraphrase.
Okay. Can I go ahead and start?
Also, real quick, George is going to be live flowing the round on a Google Sheets. I'll drop the link in the chat.
So no, pin it to the like chat in the YouTube thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Sounds good. Nathaniel and I affirm our sole contention is mending the safety net. Michael Lewis of Oxford University writes that since the 1930s, the US's welfare system has been means tested, with 80 overlapping programs using a web of varying regulations and eligibility requirements that theoretically target resources to those who need them. Yet, in practice, Carrie Nicole of the Journal of Poverty writes in 2015 that the complexity of means testing prevents people from accessing the benefits they need. Some aren't even aware they're eligible. Others can't navigate the bureaucratic processes, and many beneficiaries lose access after breaking arbitrary rules. For example, one program that requires participants to constantly report to welfare offices to certify that their status has blocked millions from benefits, trapping them in poverty. A study by Richard Caputo of the Journal of Social Services found that for every 4 of every 5 low-income people eligible for one of the largest means-tested programs never received benefits, which is why since 1980, the number of families who have met requirements of the safety net but remain in poverty has quadrupled. This problem affects the entire welfare system. Robert Moffitt of Johns Hopkins University finds in 2016 that despite a 5-fold increase in per capita means-tested spending, it's consistently failed to reach those who need the assistance the most. As their strict requirements have expanded, fewer families could access programs, and thus Moffitt quantifies that benefits received by families in deep poverty have decreased by 35%. For example, Quentin Palfrey of the Governing Institute writes in 2017 that for one means-tested program, 7 million eligible individuals can't claim benefits that would have amounted to a month's income, with complex regulations seen at all levels on the welfare system. Apart from directly entrenching long-term poverty, these have severe short-term consequences. Scott Santens of George Washington University finds in 2019, every year thousands of people die while waiting to prove their eligibility for a single welfare program. For those who do navigate the requirements of means testing, the process is time-consuming. As Santens further, that people who try to claim food stamps can be forced to spend 8 hours a day in government offices, all for an average benefit of $5. Henrik Kleben of Columbia University quantifies, for welfare recipients, the time lost and administrative cost involved with claiming benefits consume over half of the eventual assistance granted by means-tested programs. And when it's granted, the assistance is rarely permanent. Jennifer Romich of the University of Washington writes in 2017 that the welfare system fails to address the fluctuating earnings, employment, and expenses that define poverty today, which is why one study quantifies that income volatility has doubled since the 1970s. Romich furthers that these programs assume families would no longer need assistance after increases in their incomes. But the reality shows that for those in poverty, changes in employment and structure are rarely permanent. For example, programs from food stamps to Medicaid have frequent recertification processes that prematurely push millions of families off their benefits. As a result, Richard Mertens of the University of Chicago finds in 2017, nearly every household that has gained income which was enough to lift them out of poverty, above the poverty line, ended up falling back into poverty within the same year. Overall, affirming would replace a broken system, as Scott Santens of George Washington University writes that in 2019, the U.S. should replace means-tested welfare with the universal basic income to maximize unconditionality, where benefits go to everyone without the requirements that define the current welfare state. Only a quarter of those eligible for housing or disability benefits receive anything, and in some states, 90% of those beneath poverty are excluded from cash welfare. As a result, Santens conclude that a universal basic income would stop millions of households from falling through the holes in the safety net by removing the means testing that creates the holes in the first place. Oliver Jacquas of the Journal of Social Policy quantifies in 2018 every 1% increase in universal programs measured by the percentage of social benefits that are not means tested increases redistribution of income to the poor by 5%. Santens concludes implementing a universal basic income would make 9 out of every 10 impoverished Americans better off, even after taking the cost and removal of means-tested welfare into account. And thus, Santens concludes that poverty would be reduced by 74%. Thus, Nathaniel and I affirm.
May I see a few pieces of evidence? Can I see your Caputo evidence about the largest program? Can I see that the 5 times increase in spending has produced nothing benefit evidence? And then lastly, can I see that the families in deep poverty have reduced their benefits?
You mind going over those slowly? But Caputo says one of the largest means tested programs.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll send Caputo. Nathaniel, can you send the other two?
I don't remember the other two. Would you mind repeating them?
The other two were that there's been a 5 times increase in spending, and thirdly, that benefits received by families in deep poverty have decreased by a certain percent. This is like round 6 of Harvard, except no lay judge in the back.
Incredible. The fifth one is that benefits to those in deepest poverty have gone down.
Mm-hmm.
made a card sharing document in the thing, but a lot of the formatting is not translating over, but luckily the highlighting is, so you can see those parts.
Yeah, sorry, can you give me a second? I'm just gonna go grab my charger. My laptop's about to die.
Mm. Actually, can I also see the thing that talks about arbitrary rules and complexity? It's like the second card in the case. Thanks.
If you want me to get Capucho, I can get it up right now. So.
Oh, I just sent a doc with the card on there.
Okay. I believe only one section of that card that Sai just sent is the part that you called for. So I think we just sent the entire card because that's what we read in case.
I still don't have Caputo.
I'll just put it from the document into the other document.
Works.
Very top.
Okay, cool. I'm good then. So the order is going to be one off and then case. The off is a shell. I recommend you flow it on another sheet of paper. And then case is case. Is everyone good? Cool. Interpretation: when evidence is introduced in a round, it must be read as a full cut card and not paraphrase. Violation: they paraphrase all of their case evidence. Standards: the first is evidence ethics. Paraphrasing reduces nuanced and in-depth evidence into biased two-sentence summaries, empirically proven by the widespread use of misconstrued evidence in this activity. Cards ensure tags are grounded in direct quotes and make it easier to check for misrepresentation, which deters cheating. Evidence ethics are key to fairness. They can make infinite arguments through misrepresentation, while we're limited to topic literature. Also education: if their cards don't say what they say they do, we're not learning from experts, we're learning what they want us to. Second is more research. Paraphrasing encourages lazy research practices where teams only find mediocre evidence and then misconstrue it rather than reading more topic literature to find the best evidence. This harms education because debaters learn less about the topic and do less research. Third is prep skew. If we want to know the quote of their evidence, not only does it require us to use prep time while they don't have to, but it also takes longer to read through the parts they paraphrase than our quotes. This destroys fairness because it decreases our time to prepare in-round strategy. Voters vote on fairness, abuse prevents objective evaluation of substance and the round, which is your intrinsic role as a judge, and education. It's why schools fund debate and the only long-lasting value. You should drop them because a vote for us endorses a positive model of debate. Wins and losses determine the direction of the activity, and teams losing for bad practices incentivizes change in the future, which makes debate more educational and fair as a whole. Additionally, all of their cards are paraphrased, which means drop the argument becomes drop the debater regardless. Default to competing interpretations, judge intervention is bad. This shell is not a reverse voting issue, meaning they cannot gain offense on an RVI or a counter interpretation for two reasons. Because it chills theory. A, because we should be allowed to test the legitimacy of the other team. We shouldn't lose for being wrong, or else nobody would ever risk checking abuse. And B, it encourages good debaters to be intentionally abusive. People will bait theory by having terrible evidence like Nathaniel's and then win off RVIs. With that, go to the case. Bethesda Chevy Chase negates the United States should not replace means-tested welfare with a UBI. Contention one is stability. Means-tested welfare programs serve a unique purpose in the economy, that of an automatic stabilizer. Robert Rubin at the Washington Post writes in 2017, these programs serve as automatic stabilizers during an economic downturn. In a weak economy, as more people lose income and become eligible for federal benefits, the programs expand, putting more money in more people's pockets. People then spend that money, increasing demand and helping the economy recover. Unfortunately, a UBI could not serve the same function. As Ortiz 18 of the ILO explains, from an economic perspective, the UBI does not act as an automatic stabilizer, as it does not go up or down in a downturn. Replacing our automatic stabilizers with a UBI would be devastating for two reasons, and the first is worsening recessions. By massively increasing the stimulus they provide whenever the economy slumps, auto stabilizers drastically shorten recessions. Lee 19 of the Brookings Institute quantifies this effect, reporting that after examining economic stabilization policy from 1980 to 2010, auto stabilizers provided about half of total fiscal stabilization. This stimulus is crucial to the recovery of our economy in all future recessions. As Stone 15 of US News explains, without the full set of federal responses, the 2008 recession would have been more than 3 times deeper and lasted twice as long. The second impact of killing off auto stabilizers is inequality. Because stabilizers dramatically increase the stimulus they provide when recessions hit and scale back the stimulus they provide when economy begins to overheat, they keep economies stable. Removing them has the opposite effect, as Rice 18 of Columbia University finds, if automatic stabilizers were scaled back in size by 0.6% of GDP, then US output would be about 7% more volatile. This volatility is devastating, as Miller 14 of the University of Nevada explains that growth volatility affects the distribution of income, as risk-averse laborers willingly accept a decrease in their average earnings for a constant wage. Thus, Miller concludes that a 1% increase in volatility increases income inequality 1.51%. Income inequality crushes the poor as it creates incentives for pharmaceutical and healthcare companies to charge massive rates for health services. With high inequality, they stand to profit more from charging exorbitant prices of the exorbitantly rich rather than catering to the broader market with affordable rates. Thus, Bajruka 14 of the Boston Review finalizes that there is growing evidence that the factor most responsible for the relatively poor health in the United States is the vast and rising inequality in wealth and income. He cites a recent Harvard study which estimated about 1 in 3 deaths in this country results from high income inequality. Save lives, prevent volatility, and negate. I'm good for cross if you are.
Could I quickly see some cards?
Sure.
Could I see the evidence that MTW acts as a stabilizer, whereas UBI cannot?
Yep.
And then at the very bottom, Bezrushka saying that we see a lot of death from inequality.
Absolutely. So in the card sharing doc, all 3 of the pieces of evidence you requested are there. Wait, one
Wait,
second.
can you send a link to the card sharing doc? I'm not on it.
Yeah, you are on it. It's in your folder, but I can send it. Check the Zoom chat, Eli.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I'm good for cross if you are.
Okay. Yeah. Let me get a timer. Sorry. So on the standard about evidence ethics, since all of our evidence is disclosed, doesn't that make it just as easy for you to check back against us as like us to you?
No.
Why not?
So just because your evidence is disclosed does not mean you disclose the ways that you paraphrase it, does not mean you disclose your highlights, does not mean that I know which piece of each card you read. And also, even if it was, I don't want to spend my 30 minutes before the round checking if your evidence is fair while you can prep me out. I have to read all of your cards to see if they actually say what you say they do.
If
Whereas
you can check back against evidence regardless, right? Then there's like no incentive for you to not paraphrase either. So doesn't that like create the same disadvantage?
I have no idea what that question was, but you just asked one. Can I take one?
Sure.
Okay. On your piece of evidence about deep poverty, you say, in case, holistically, that means-tested welfare has expanded significantly over the last 40 years, but benefits to the poorest, those in deep poverty, have dramatically decreased. Your evidence talks about one group. What group is it?
I'm not sure. This is Nathaniel.
Single mothers. So when you paraphrase the card to be about everyone in deep poverty, when it's only about single mothers.
Wait. No. I'm pretty sure we point out one example, but regardless.
No, you don't. You don't say the word single mothers once in case, and your evidence is only about single mothers. I read it round 6 of Harvard, and again before this crossfire, and it's been terrible both times. So here's
you isolate one example, but regardless,
you don't. You say the word.
The evidence single mothers are those like the group that's in deepest poverty. Like we can talk about that later, but can I have a question real quick?
Sure.
Do you bracket your evidence like any of the cards?
We bracket for conjugations, but not for words. So like we'll make something that's past tense, or we'll make something that's like present. If it needs to preserve like grammatical integrity of a sentence, we'd add like an S.
Okay, then doesn't that violate then?
No.
Why? Like you're like making the cards say what you want them to say instead of what they actually say, right?
No, you're making it so that I can speak in proper English while reading what the card says. Can I take a question?
Wait, no, but like the idea of the show is that like the interpretation of the evidence changes based on what we add. Aren't you doing the same thing? Even if
No. So here's the issue. A, it doesn't link into any of our 3 standards, and B, it's definitionally not paraphrasing. There's a huge difference between paraphrasing evidence. I mean, if you want to get like the dictionary definitions of what paraphrasing is, so we can go through the text of the interp, I can, but I'd rather take a question. So on your Caputo evidence, actually better idea. On your like Nicole evidence, which is the second card in case, in like your case, you read that like complexity prevents people from accessing the benefits they need, beneficiaries lose access after breaking arbitrary rules, and a bunch of other things about means-tested welfare that you say like culminate in people not getting access.
Sure.
So your card, and as it's highlighted, says like shorter recertification periods decrease participation, transaction costs related to documentation exist, there are work requirements, etc. None of this at all like terminalizes to the ways you terminalize it, right? Like
Wait, we literally talked about requirements leading to more like difficulty accessing welfare. There's just
you don't see anything about certification periods or how many people don't get access or anything like that.
Administration in the cut you just read, but regardless, that's cross.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
I'm going to quickly make a document so we can see the stuff that I'm about to read. It's labeled first rebuttal. Great, let everyone, it's going to be interacting with their shell that they read, and then 2 new off-case arguments or new shells that you can flow.
Wait, 2 new shells?
Yes.
I thought you said I only needed 4 sheets.
I flowed this on 4 sheets because the shells are not super long.
Very cool.
Okay, is it going to our case at all? Sorry.
No.
Okay.
I'll paste the link in the chat real quick if you want to.
We're good.
Click that way.
Alrighty.
Is anybody not ready? Excellent. All right. So starting on their paraphrasing shell, they claim broadly that we should not be able to paraphrase evidence, and they give a couple of standards for this. The first claims that evidence ethics are hurt. No, NSTA evidence challenges and in-round indicts solve their shell much more extensively than theory. They next claim there's less research. Well, paraphrasing means we use our own words, improving communication skills. You can't read quotes in real life, constraining any out-of-round benefit their shell has, which outweighs in-round impacts on scope. And 3, they claim there's a prep skew. No, these harms are self-inflicted. The burden's on them to prove why they limited themselves by quoting. Then, more broadly against their argument. 1, counterinterpretation. Teams must paraphrase disclosed evidence. Prefer A, disclosure checks all their harms and outweighs on scopes. There's more time to see evidence than just in round. They ask and cross a standard for how we should disclose evidence, and they ask C, they're highlighting and paraphrasing, which I did disclose on our wiki. B, this best mirrors real-world practices where academics paraphrase but disclose their sources, helping education. And C, this creates competitive incentives to disclose, which is good. It lets small schools equalize intelligence deterrents to improve clash, and it improves argument quality through cross-pollination and visible testing. 2, counterinterpretation. Teams may paraphrase if they can point to cut cards they paraphrased from. Prefer A, forces comprehension and rephrasing of evidence instead of parroting what someone else said, helping education. B, allows deeper and nuanced arguments if presentation isn't constrained by quotes, but verification is. And C, it's the explicit standard NSDA rules give, which are accessible to everyone who's not in these theory rounds and make evidence debates predictable and preparable. Finally, if we beat their theory argument, you vote them down. 4 warrants. A, their theory is an interpretation for how debate should be, so us beating it means you drop them to discourage that model. B, otherwise they get 2 paths to the ballot on theory and substance, while we get 1 while having covered both. C, this makes theory debate reciprocal, improving fairness by giving us a way to win. If it's a no-risk issue, every team would only read theory rather than debate where they could lose. And D, voting down bad theory deters frivolous arguments, ensuring future theory is only against true abuse. Briefly, they argue that we should not have RVIs because it would chill theory. Well, broadly against both these points, if it's true that someone's being abusive and using that practice to win the round, even if you would lose the round on theory, you would have lost the round regardless if you did not beat that abusive practice. Winning the theory or on the rest of the debate would still mean you would lose either way. Additionally, they argue that people would be intentionally abusive. Judges can check this easily, and teams can also read more theoretical arguments that can beat that. If people are being very clearly abusive, they will win the theory debate. Let's go into 2 independent arguments why they should lose based on their theory. First point. PF's traditional style has seen explosion in popularity by its argumentation's accessibility to all programs. Thus, teams should not introduce theory in a round where theory hasn't been read already. 2 reasons. 1, the theory they normalize isn't something you know to learn about without the help of coaches or camps, as no other activity sets rounds rules mid-game. This biases theory debate to the privilege, and it being a precondition to norm setting means the norms set are at best paternalistic and at worst actively self-serving. 2, norm setting through theory only sets norms for those plugged into the national circuit. For people just joining it, they shouldn't lose on rules of evidence they didn't know existed. More broadly, prioritize access over questions of the quality of debate. 3 warrants. 1, marginally, the additional benefit someone gets from 4 additional years of participation in debate is more than improvements to an activity for people who already benefit. 2, lowering entry barriers maximizes the perspectives we include for how to improve the activity. And 3, expanding access filters who participates in debate, which prioritizing its quality creates an insular, ivory tower activity that only benefits the rich, white male debaters predisposed to participate. Second point, teams should make theoretical arguments in paragraph form, just making claims backed by warrants, not their structured shells with interrupt violation standards. 2 reasons. 1, theory beyond what most teams consider to be the bounds of the debate is much harder to understand in a rigid system new debaters haven't heard of. 2, jargon and hyperspecific paradigm issues, like the ones they say with like counterinterpretation, RBI, can't be known without extensive research beforehand, which can resolve theory debates on technicalities instead of which norm is better. The form of their arguments we critiqued is a prior burden to their content. 3 reasons. 1, burden. Given inclusive and effective ways to make their arguments, they must first prove why they made their arguments in this way before their voting issues. 2, prereq. Discussions of process will dominate out-of-round theory discussions and stigmatize talk about norm setting, which happen more often than in-round theory. 3, probability. Harms to the process are guaranteed compared to uncertain outcomes, which are also path-dependent on the successful process. To win, they must beat our 2 arguments and then win the paraphrasing debate. Thank you.
We'll take prep once Eli calls.
Okay, it'll be on Nathaniel's theory dishads.
How much
Then-
prep remaining?
Huh?
How much prep remaining?
0.
Oh,
Then Arshel. Anybody not ready? On the first theory just had on their first one about coaches, a couple problems. First is that lots of resources are solving the status quo like PF Forward, which means that all of this material is really accessible to everyone with or without coaches. So there's no offense and there's no uniqueness anymore. This was true maybe a year ago, but now progressive arguments are much more universal on the circuit. But second, we would say we're a small school who last year didn't even have a coach until the very end of the year, which means that empirics prove that you can be good at theory and you can read theory without being from a massive school with lots of money, and that's super privileged on the circuit. Then they say that our norms are self-serving, but we're trying to make the activity more fair and educational. Also, they themselves say that reading cards makes the round sluggish and puts us at a disadvantage as a response to our prep skew argument, which they say is self-inflicted. So clearly, like, yeah, the norms aren't self-serving. It's just better for education and fairness overall. On exclusivity, they get no access to the accessibility weighing because of the defense, but fairness outweighs accessibility on contextualization because there's no idea how many teams leave the circuit or don't join at all. But fairness is visible in the determination made by Will in this round and the judges in every other round. Then go to the other disad. Two things. First is that we're happy to define any of the terms that were unclear or jargony in Crossfire, which solves all of their offense. They could have asked if they were unclear on what the terms meant, but they didn't. Second is that PF forward again solves because it defines all of the terms and has zero barrier for access, which means anyone can have access to the definitions of the terms. And third is that the shell is disclosed on the wiki and the interp is disclosed on the wiki, and so is our contact information, which means if you were concerned about this before the round, you could have just contacted us and asked us what any of this means. Yeah. All right. Then on our shell, first they say that evidence challenges and indicts solve a couple problems. First, we don't have time to call for all of your evidence without massively delaying the tournament or prep skewing ourselves, and we don't have speech time to indict all of your evidence without losing the round. But B is that evidence challenges do not promote norms, only theory does, and evidence challenges are insufficient because you can misrepresent every card you read slightly, and an evidence challenge will just cost us the round, whereas preventing paraphrasing solves this entirely. Their second response concedes the standard. It's just an independent disad. It's also not true. We have to use our own words when extending. Here you just increase education as we have to explain complex evidence simply in things like cross-examination rather than simplifying cross ideas into what we want them to be. On their third response, this generates a race to the bottom where teams do exceedingly abusive things because the other team could have two, destroying the activity. You should vote to preserve fairness. On disclosure solves, one disclosure can't solve is I have to waste time indicting all of your misrepresented evidence just to have you replace it with more misrepresentations, costing me speech time and skewing fairness. Second, unless you disclose both the cards you read and how you paraphrase them, disclosure doesn't solve back as I can't remember everything every card you read actually says during the round. Third, in PF, nobody discloses their blocks or anything they mean read in rebuttal, which means our solvency is far broader because, like, again, I don't have enough prep time to read every card read in a given, every paraphrase card read in a given rebuttal to check back for potential misconstruction. Fourth, even if disclosure solves, you can spend the time before the round prepping me out, whereas I have to waste time double checking your evidence integrity, killing fairness. On real world practices, there's no warrant as to why these practices in the real world are good. We're winning that specifically for the debate space. Our practice is better on competitive incentives to disclose. Disclosure theory already does that in our shell. Always on clarity. These disclosures, good standards are blipped in 15 words. Our shell is super clear. On having cut cards solves, cross-apply the responses from before because we still don't have time to check for their abuse. On evidence processing, one, this argument is nonsensical. Regardless of whether you reword evidence, you still have to process it as debaters which haven't thoroughly processed their evidence will get exposed and cross and lose rounds. Second, turn it instead of processing complex evidence, you misrepresent it to say what you wish it would, meaning you're doing less processing and skewing fairness. On deeper and more nuanced arguments, this concedes the link into our second standard of finding evidence. Finding better evidence means you can make these same nuanced arguments. And on NSDA rules, these are a floor, not a ceiling. They don't require content warnings, but content warnings are still good.
Nathaniel, can we take prep before cross?
About a minute 45 taken, leaving us with a minute 15. Everybody good to go with second crossfire?
Yeah, 100%.
What?
I said yes, 100%. I'm good for second
Excellent.
class.
All right. So you argue that you were in this activity, you were trying to make the activity better, right?
Correct.
Whose perspectives get included and who makes the activity better?
Wait. We are making arguments with warrants as to why paraphrasing makes the activity less educational and less fair because
That's
you get
not
access
exactly.
to-
I'm sorry, Eli, but that is not my question. Whose perspectives are included in who makes these warrants, who introduces them, who questions their ability?
who I don't know what you're getting at with this, but like we did make the warrants.
Then
I mean,
maybe you are one of these people.
They're pretty common. Like this is the shell was like largely taken originally from like David Kinane's shell, and every paraphrasing shell that I've heard or judged has been very similar, which means that
Okay, great. So we can agree though that the people who are doing this are the people who are included in these sorts of theory rounds, correct?
I don't know what you mean by these sorts of theory rounds.
Rounds where theory is
I'm
discussed.
saying that these standards we read are common reasons within the activity and sensible reasons why paraphrasing is bad.
Eli, I think the question that you're answering is a question of what, and my question is who. A lot of our arguments question who gets to participate in the discussions of what is a good norm, and your answer is we have made arguments for why your norm is good, and that assumes again that the people who are having these discussions are
anybody can participate.
Anybody can participate.
Yeah.
Can participate or does participate is the question. It's not the question of who could potentially participate in these rounds. What?
You're gonna put this burden on us to like solve for
We're not going to. We have.
Okay. We cannot solve for whether or not people want to participate in these debates. What we are saying is that we are more than happy, and that's what I said in rebuttal too. Like our contact info is on the wiki. Anybody watching this round that has any questions about theory, please Facebook message me or email me. I'm like so happy to explain it to you. And we will do everything in our power to make theory more, and are doing everything in our power to make theory more accessible to the circuit.
Eli, you are not doing everything in your power if you're saying these harms are checkable if people reach out to me and check these harms. Not only one, does this bite into all the same problems that you identify about setting good norms for this activity, right? Just people messaging in private channels does not set good norms for how that channel ought to operate in a theory round. But also number two, that only applies to people who have the confidence, who have the ability to go and message you, who are like Facebook friends with you. I don't think that this ought to apply if we just say you can figure it yourself. Instead, we ought to again make a better floor. I think your response about NSDA rules, saying that it's a floor, not a ceiling, presupposes that that floor is even there, when your floor is just saying, I'll make a bunch of theory arguments and you can maybe fix it later on if you think that it's...
Please don't give a speech in the middle of cross. What we are saying is that the NSDA rules provide a basic minimum for what something can do to be the basic minimum of fairness in education. We think that content warnings are good for debate when people read triggering material.
Well, Eli, you asked me to repeat a speech and you repeated your speech. I think my point is the question shouldn't just be if your arguments are good, but the question is whose perspectives do you include in these arguments? We have like 4 male debaters in this round discussing about theory. It is not the most inclusive way to discuss how we should make good norms for the activity.
Okay. Nathaniel, do you need anything else? Okay.
That's an additional 40 seconds taken, leaving us with 35.
Yeah. So it's gonna go Nathaniel's 2 theory DAs, and then if I have time, it'll be back to yours. Is anyone not ready? Okay. On the first EA, they give you a couple of responses. First, they say there's resources that decrease barriers to access. Two problems here. First of all, we say there's still tons of teams who don't have access to these resources because they don't know about them in the first place. For example, PF Forward is a pretty niche website, and I didn't even know about it until like someone read theory on me. And like in particularly low income areas or rural areas where theory isn't introduced at all, we say these teams don't even have a reason to look into these kinds of websites or resources in the first place and can't access coaches or camps which introduces them or tells them to look into them. At that point, they're literally ignoring a huge group for no reason other than the fact that it worked out for them. They're one example of a circuit team, and they literally competed in that circuit last year. There's tons of lower income, lower resources teams that don't have access. Next, they talk about how like they're not creating norms for themselves because absent theory, the round is more sluggish. One, this depends on them winning their shell, but two, and independent of that, even if the round becomes on net more sluggish, it still gets skewed towards them because they've been not paraphrasing for a long time, and this norm helps them win round, i.e. why they read the shell. Then they talk about how fairness outweighs. We'll talk about that later. First, we'll extend what Nathaniel's diss at is. We tell you that there are tons of debaters who don't understand theory or can't access it because they haven't had the coaches, camps, or other kinds of resources to access theory, which pushes them out of the round and pushes them to quit when these kinds of arguments are read, especially when these kinds of teams introduce them first. This links into accessibility, and so does the second argument. On the second argument, he gives you a couple responses. First, he says that he would clarify terms. This literally has the same problem as what he says on paraphrase. We have to go through a lot of terms. It's pretty hard to get terms the first time, especially if you're a novice debater and barely know what you're doing. And third of all, this isn't like a check back. Some teams might even be too scared to ask for clarification, especially considering how high the barrier it is. Next, he talks about how PF Forward is going to be acting as like access to entry. The same responses apply. A lot of lower income debaters from rural areas don't even know about these sites, and they don't even know they exist. Third, he talks about how people can contact Eli. Well, first of all, we would say these are probably primarily circuit debaters who've had experience with them before. Rural debaters and low-income debaters that live far away from Eli probably don't know them. And second of all, these same debaters probably don't even understand what NDCA is or if it exists because, again, they've never had cost look on it because of the circuits they've been on, and we're unfairly disadvantaging them by reading these disclusive arguments. At that point, you can extend the structure of the shell. We tell you that using terms that are really high acts as a barrier to entry to teams because they can't understand what's going in the round, and sets it only so that experts can norm set and actually engage in debate, which links into accessibility. And accessibility outweighs all us for three reasons. First of all, it's the most ignored problem in this round. They literally say that since we can't see it, we shouldn't solve it. But we say these people have the most to lose because it's not a matter of if they participate on a debate at a higher level or a slightly higher level, or it's if they access it at all, which is bigger scope and severity linking into both education and fairness. It's a prerequisite to access it. Second of all, we say it's a prerequisite to solving for all the issues they talk about because including diverse perspectives is the way we can create for better forms of debate. This goes conceded too. And we say that this is going to outweigh on scope because it fixes other issues other than paraphrasing. There's a tons of other issues like low income or low resource debaters that still need to be addressed. And third of all, we say like this is probably needs to be addressed first compared to a very high level of debate. These people might not even have the chance to access it if they're being pushed out of the activity constantly. On paraphrase, NSDA checks back, and it also has a bigger scope of checking back since more people can understand it. That links back into accessibility.
All right, we have no prep, so the order is going to be our shell, their shell. Is everyone ready? The only response in the shell is that NESDA rules check back. It was started at 308, so you're not evaluating, but it's also clean through ink. I'm not going to backline it. It's a waste of my time. Just look at the ink. At that point, you extend the shell. The interpretation is the debater should not paraphrase evidence. They should use cut cards instead. The violation is that they paraphrased every card they read. The standards we're going for are A, the standard on massively increasing evidence ethics and reducing misrepresentation, because now you have to read direct quotes, which is A, key to fairness because they can make infinite arguments while we're restricted to topic literature, and B, key to education because we don't learn from experts if they are not reading experts, they're reading what they want to. The voters are both conceded that education is a voter because it's the portable skill you get from the activity, and fairness is a voter because no one would participate if the activity wasn't fair. On the drop the debater argument is conceded that if we win, that we promote better norms of fairness and education. You drop them to incentivize that norm because it improves the activity. The weighing is very clear here. All of their weighing is specific to us improving the activity or operating at a higher layer in the activity and things like that. But they've conceded the actual warranting, which is that with paraphrasing, you don't get anything from the activity at all. The analysis is dropped and we don't learn anything from any of your evidence. So there's no education in the activity whatsoever. So nothing that they say matters because debate is not worth saving unless you access our shell. Also, they've conceded that we're a better link into accessibility than they are because when the activity is fundamentally unfair, people quit the activity en masse, which means all of the programs that mandate their kids cut cards are getting systematically blocked from the activity, which is probably far less nebulous and far more than whatever their nonsense accessibility and people who can't access jargon is. But with that, go to their independent DAs. On the second one about like jargon specifically, actually, let's go to the first one. They say that like actually group both. They have conceded that the only way to improve norms whatsoever is theory because the NSDA has no mechanism to do it and NSDA rules are just a floor, not a ceiling. So the only way to actually make the activity better whatsoever is theory. All of their arguments are just reasons as to why theory is bad, but they don't provide an alternative. We have proven that it is necessary to improve the activity because of things like safety for debaters and actual participation through things like trigger warnings, which means that if you buy their arguments, you kill the activity entirely. We've proven, even if we don't solve 100% of their harms, there are ways to improve accessibility of theory, accessibility of jargon, and accessibility of everything that solves back for their disad, which means you prioritize solving back for their disads and keeping theory in the activity rather than burning out theory just because there are some things that are probably wrong with it. At that point, we were winning that A, theory is probably good on net, B, there is no alternative, and C, you can probably solve their DAs even if the status quo hasn't already. On the line by line, on their first disadvantage about how people don't have access, we say that this is probably not true because the people who don't have access probably aren't being hit with theory arguments. Most of their people who aren't getting access in rural communities and so forth don't see theory. It's primarily read, like Nathaniel says in Crossfire, by white debaters and by cis debaters on the overall circuit. So this doesn't really reach the people that they say it's so badly harming. But also we say for those people, things like the internet are fully accessible. PF Forward has increased membership every single time it is solving. On the second argument, they don't specify any specific jargon. And so you don't give them any offense. There's nothing that we can't define. All of the words are just words.
We're skipping Gran, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Great. We'll take the remaining 35 seconds of prep time.
Nathan, you're at negative 23 seconds.
What? Looks like I've taken all the prep time, and I started the call, or started the prep when the call went through, right?
You had 31 seconds left.
Okay.
So you're at negative 33 seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
Everyone good to go with the speech? Excellent.
What's the order? Sorry.
Not exactly in order on this show. It's going to be a bunch of broad arguments.
Okay. Just signpost, please. Thanks.
Excellent. Just top level overview that'll frame the round. All right. To evaluate this round, you must check your implicit biases on who participates in the type of debates that we are participating in. All four of us are here in a theory round because we know about theory, we have been experienced in the national circuit, and we have debated it many times. We are receptive to this argument implicitly, and the judges as well. And all of these are just examples that are the exception towards the overall structural barriers that people face to engaging in these sorts of debates in the activity. They've conceded two weighing mechanisms coming out of side summary, and they're already in our first rebuttal as well, that all identify why you prioritize questions of access over any impact they could get that they kind of like blithely extend in their last speech. One is that these issues are definitionally most ignored because the people who look at them are the ones who did not get excluded from the activity in the first place and are able to participate in discussions of theory, all four of us here. Number two is on scope because we can address many more issues that are under addressed now if we conclude the perspectives of those who are affected by those issues. All the examples of things they identify are people who are facing massive uphill battles because the way in which they are forced to engage in norm setting are inaccessible to the majority of debaters. They can see the warrants that we give in our speech, i.e. number one, that you won't know about how to set rules in round if you don't know to set the rules in round in the first place, a norm that is only set when people like them who have coaches and camps can learn about how to engage in that activity. And number two, the norm setting that they affect, which they concede happens in a minority of rounds, only affects those who come into a national circuit. And when people are going to their first national circuit tournament and get theory read on them, they lose for norms they didn't know existed because they were not plugged into the set of norm setting that they assumed as accessible to everyone. To this, they give a couple of impacts. These are extending their impacts and not explaining why they link into them necessarily. They say we don't learn anything. One, it's a link into education that doesn't disappear. And number two, this is in the importance of perspectives, i.e. they assume you don't learn anything without including the perspectives of people who certainly do from paraphrased rounds. If you just assume that your perspective is universal, you will never understand what other people do. They argue that people will quit if there's no fairness. Number one, they concede uniqueness, that PF has flourished in the face of this, that it's become more accessible and more people have joined because of its traditional style. And two, people quit before engaging. They assume it doesn't reach everyone because it's not a norm right now. And they also assert that the internet solves while dropping that it only happens to invested people. It is not necessarily your place or of anyone in this round to determine what is accessible towards other people who have quit the activity because of their inability to engage in the style of argumentation that they are pushing. Instead, vote for the thing that maximizes access for the greatest marginal benefit towards everyone in the activity, not just a few.
Okay, since y'all got 30 extra seconds of prep, we're going to take 30 extra seconds of prep. Starting now.
We did not take 30 extra seconds of prep. We started our time when the call went through, and the additional time that you were timing was us talking to you about how much prep we took.
Okay, all right. So it's going to start on our shell, then go to their arguments. Everyone good? All right. Start on our shell, extend it. A is the interpretation. When evidence is introduced in round, must be read as a full cut card, not paraphrase. B is the violation they paraphrase. C is the standards. Evidence misrepresentation gives them access to infinite arguments, while we're restricted to the topic literature, massively skewing ground and fairness. D is the voters. Fairness is the voters. Judges are asked to vote for who the better debaters are. No one would participate if the activity wasn't fair. And the other voter is education, which is the only portable skill in debate. E is drop the debater to set better norms in the future by disincentivizing the practice of paraphrasing. Okay, then go to their arguments. They go for access, but they have conceded that access is totally worthless without theory, because without theory, people can be infinitely abusive, how uneducational and unfair practices like paraphrasing or not having content warnings, etc. So in a world without theory, which is the norm their disad promotes, it destroys the value of access for everyone, meaning they have zero offense whatsoever, and you vote for us because whatever people are currently able to access debate, at least they get something from it. But their only response is that PF has flourished, but the status quo has theory. On their argument, regardless, the analysis is conceded that even in the status quo, people are pushed out of the activity by theory. As theory proliferates, so does accessibility. With more people reading theory, more resources like PF Forward are reaching more people, more jargon is being defined, and accessibility is increasing overall. Our world has theory, which preserves the value of this activity and increasingly has access. Their world has access to nothing of value and no theory. Lastly, they have conceded that the only people affected by theory are those who are in theory rounds. That is how the effects of theory work. So those pushed out of debate by theory are few and far between, whereas we affect everyone and decisions are made by those who engage. We are winning every layer pretty cleanly. Don't let Nathaniel's voice and demeanor win your ballot. One more thing, they say that norm setting is only possible on the national circuit with theory and has too many high barriers, but they've conceded that there is no way whatsoever to set norms through the NSDA, which means we're the only risk of setting norms that are actually good, that actually promote access, which is why you're voting for us on a risk of promoting access and fairness in addition to what we are winning on our shell. It's like game over for Nathaniel.
And Sai.
Sorry.
Good round, guys.
Good round.
Interesting.
Am I supposed to give an RFD and then
Yes,
do
please.
an overview of the round?
I need you to give an RFD because I either lose my soul further or get my soul back. This is very high stakes.
Yeah, we'll go RFD, then analysis, and then we'll have the debaters give their takes on the speeches.
Okay, sounds good. So in this debate, I would have ended up voting for Bethesda. So I think that they're winning, that in a world without theory, there could be infinite abuse and infinite unfair things that push more people out of the activity than just a random theory debate here and there. I think Bethesda is right. And I think that this is a issue that I think a lot of theory bad arguments run into, is that the impact is just so small. You're talking about rural people that don't know what theory is, etc. But how often are those people actually in a theory debate? And how often are those people in a theory debate quit the activity because of that theory? It's probably more likely that they're in a theory debate and they're like, oh, this is interesting, or oh, I don't know how to respond to this. So they go learn about it. They go seek out these resources that Bethesda's talking about, and they actually end up getting more education. Yeah, so I also think Bethesda's pretty cleanly winning their shell, and if they're winning that paraphrasing is key, or not paraphrasing is key to fairness and education, then it sort of undermines the inherent impacts that the AF is going for, because like even if debate is accessible, if debate's not educational or fair, then it doesn't really matter. So I have a few overall thoughts on this debate. So first is, I think, Nathaniel, and I think in most debates, I think that y'all should be careful about reading multiple counter interpretations and multiple theory arguments, because I think a lot of them sort of contradict or sort of don't mesh well. I saw this in the chat, and I was thinking about it also, is like a lot of arguments about inclusivity and then like your arguments about needing to disclose on the wiki don't necessarily mesh well and could contradict in a world where like you go for multiple of them. So I just watch out for that. And then so specifically on the like two theory disads, the paragraph form argument, the impact is just so small. There's really any scope weighing about how paraphrasing affects the entire activity or like future rounds, etc., future years would outweigh it massively. And also, you say that like you're not reading a paragraph, or like paragraph form is good, but like your paragraph is literally just the same as a shell without the words, like inter, violation, standards. So like there's no difference between saying like interpretation, debater shouldn't paraphrase, or like debater shouldn't paraphrase. I think if you do go for an argument like this, there should be much more like specificity in the round, rather than just sort of more broad general analysis, which I think sort of leads me into my next sort of thing, is I think that you need to be much more specific about impacts of in-round inclusivity or inclusivity, etc., instead of just being general and broadness. Because I think in a theory debate, especially like arguments that's like, hold up, etc., like your second argument on your sort of overview at the top of your final focus was like, you outweigh on scope because you can address many other issues, but you don't specify what issues you're actually like helping beyond just like not having theory, etc., and being more inclusive. So if you're like, being more inclusive is good because it allows us to solve X, Y, and Z issues, I think that's much more specific and much better, because Bethesda's reading pretty hyper specific arguments as to why specifically paraphrasing is bad, and why it'd be good to not have it. Yeah, so that's sort of just an overall analysis. I'm gonna head out. Good job, everyone. Have fun with the rest of the analysis.
Cool, sounds good. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Will.
Okay, cool. I guess if we just want to go speech by speech, talking about, I guess, Roy, if you want to start really quickly and just run through the standards and what they are, and then we can just go from there.
The first standard says that so none of the standards in our shell are actually what we go for in terms of the narrative of the theory. We kind of just mesh them all together in the back half, which is, I think, the way you should debate theory generally. Should be less about the individual standards and less of a technical procedure and more of the narrative of the practice being bad per the arguments that are somewhat in the thing. Like, there's no reason as to why theory debate needs to get rid of the narrative aspect of public forum, and like the narrative aspect that's won like TOC and Nats and yada yada and every tournament in this activity, right? So the kind of narrative we go for with the three standards is, the first one argues that it's harder to check back against misrepresentation when you paraphrase. The second one argues that that means you have to do less research. And the third one argues that attempting to check back against your misrepresentation takes longer for us. And so we mesh these all together in the like mid to back half, as paraphrasing enables you to highlight a billion words and make it and paraphrase, condense them into like 1 or 2 lines, which makes it impossible for us to check whether or not your evidence says what it says it does, which causes like misrepresentation to be uncheckable against. So even if you can misrepresent in either world, even if cutting cards could theoretically misrepresent, it's much easier to check back against misrepresentation when done through cut card than it is your 20 lines of highlighted text condensed into 2 sentences in case. Yeah.
Can I just interject really quickly because I have to go? Sorry, I told you before, Monica, but thank you for doing this, and good job, Sign Nathaniel. It was a real pleasure. And I was serious during the round. If you ever have questions about theory, please feel free to email me or Facebook message me. You don't need to, I never have to have met you in person. I'm happy to answer any questions. So is Roy.
We were a one-team school with no friends too. Once upon a time, we are more than happy to answer any questions.
But good job, guys. Y'all, good night.
Thanks, Eli.
Good job, y'all.
Yeah, but so that's it. It's kind of just like 3 independent arguments about how like it's easier to misrepresent when you paraphrase. Being easier to misrepresent. Literally, the internal link into all 3 of the arguments is that it's easier to misrepresent when you paraphrase, because that controls whether or not you can just use shitty evidence, which is the second one, and that controls whether or not like you have to look at all of their. I mean, I guess the third one's kind of separate, but the general thesis of the contentions is that it takes much longer to see if they're misrepresenting when they can condense lines and lines of text into a few.
Nathaniel, if you want to just run through, I guess, like the CIs as well as paragraph theory and what that is. And then your, I guess, 2 DAs.
So the counter-interpretations were both arguing that there are different ways to evaluate a debate over whether or not it's paraphrased. Both of them are explaining that there are external ways that you can paraphrase well that don't link into the harms of paraphrasing and maybe have even additional benefits. The first one talked about how if you can disclose evidence, then it gets out of the harms of evidence misrepresentation that Roy talked about, because then people can see your evidence before round and notice if it's misrepresented, helping you check it in round. And I think there are a couple other additional benefits, stuff like best mirroring the real world or creating incentives to disclose, which are both reasons why the counter-interpretation is better than the other one, right? Reading just a defensive reason why the counter-interpretation is better doesn't really win the round until you explain why it's a better way to go than the original interpretation. The second one also talks about a separate practice you can do alongside paraphrasing, which is pointing to cut cards that you paraphrased. And this one also talked about additional benefits of that, like forcing you to comprehend your evidence, allowing you to make deeper and nuanced arguments, and finally lining up with NSDA rules. I think this final standard, final reason why this counter-interpretation was better is linking into a broader idea that we tried to push for in the second half of the round, which is about accessibility, in that it's hard to say whether or not theory is accessible from the point of view of some theory debaters. And so we should default to making the round as accessible as possible to people who aren't plugged into the national circuit or people who don't have a ton of friends on the national circuit, which helps you learn this better if you don't have a couple $1,000s to drop on a debate camp. And if we go into the off-case arguments later on, we can talk about those further. So, and then finally, a section of the debate that didn't really come into question as much was about if we beat the theory argument, you should vote them down, which is what the neg argument labels as an RVI, or reverse voting issue, where this argument was saying that if we respond to the theory argument and you believe that you should not have to paraphrase, then we should win the debate. Now, this didn't really become too much of an issue in the rest of the debate because it kind of became a debate of like, are these norms good or bad? So we kind of just skipped over that. But the main arguments under these are about how teams would generally run theory if they knew they couldn't lose on it. And there has to be some risk if you're going to make an argument like that. But not too important. The 2 arguments that were very broadly against the debate against theory were both about why the form of the theory that they read was bad, or why the form of the arguments that they made were bad. And the first one is against theory more broadly, talking about how not everybody has access to this. And the first reason was just that like you wouldn't know to read theory until you go to these sorts of private coaching or debate camps. And the other one was that if you set norms through theory, then most people don't get access to those norms. And so when they do hit it, they don't know about them until they lose the round. And then I think the main point of these were just not necessarily to be their best independent arguments, but ways to link into the question of access, the question of who can access discussions of theory, who can access discussions of what norms to set. Because if the only people who can discuss what norms to set are the rich white male debaters who went to debate camps and have debate coaches, then the type of debate that's reflected will be the type of debate that is best done by rich white male debaters who went to debate camps and have debate coaches. And so that's kind of the argument that we're trying to go for in the second half. And that's also kind of similar to the second argument about how the way that theory is presented is pretty important. And we explained about how like the paragraph structure is much more accessible than reading strict shells that have like all these paragraph things. And we didn't end up going for this one because actually I thought that the way that BCC debated their shell was much more accessible than we expected them to. So kudos to them about not focusing too heavily on stuff like, oh, they dropped the second warrant on RVIs, or they dropped the counter interpretations are crucial. All these sort of paradigm issues that in maybe other formats you'll see determine theory debates, but are not really important to the question of is paraphrasing good or bad practice, or is theory good or bad practice? So did not become relevant throughout the second half of the round. So I think more broadly, though, a lot of the arguments just question who can access the discussions of theory, who can take part in these theory demo rounds. And a lot of them kind of folded under the general narrative.
Okay, cool. I guess, Roy, if you want to go into summary decisions, by the way, to everyone watching, feel free to drop questions in like the YouTube chat, I guess. I'll drop them to the debaters to answer towards the end.
So I'll do rebuttal first. So Glickman and I took 3 minutes of prep before rebuttal and really just kind of talked out strategy and what we wanted to do. And we noticed that the responses to the shell were very lacking in terms of how they addressed the like obviously untrue, but like I like to call them the nexus points of the shell, which are like infinite misrepresentation and like the arguments generally that paraphrasing kills the activity. So we figured if we could win the shell, regardless of their weighing, I could just like redo weighing. And so we decided to massively protect the shell and handle everything they do with like 4 responses on disclosure solves, 4 responses and all, but like, and kind of undercover the DAs and force them to go for these generic theory bad arguments and then conceal in our responses to the shell reasons why theory is good, like our answer to the NSDA rules thing, which is that NSDA rules don't change and they don't allow for things like trigger warnings, which kind of sets me up in the back half for theory is good, even if paraphrasing is also good, which is an alternate path to the ballot because theory is a norm setting argument, right? His theory bad arguments mean per his own articulations of the RVI claims. I'm going to try to explain this simpler. Nathaniel says if you lose your shells, you lose the round, which also applies to his shells, obviously, his 2 like theory bad arguments. So even if we don't win the paraphrasing shell, if we win these overarching narratives on theory is good, and we win that matters more than his RVIs or anything like that, we still win the round. So Nathaniel, in reading these theory bad arguments, gives us a second path to the ballot that we could kind of explore more in the back half, provided we were winning our shell. So Elon and I just spent 3 minutes of prep frontlining the shit out of the shell with analytics, and then figured they would collapse onto these theory bad arguments, and I could do some new weighing and kind of like cross apply front lines that we had made to the shell to their thingies. And so it was a little sketch, but Nathaniel does like APTA, which is all like analytics stuff. And I was like, yeah, and Nathaniel and his little analytic-y stuff are annoying. So I'll be sketchy too. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. And then we ran out of prep time before we could finish covering the actual shell with like as many analytics as we would have liked. So I was like, Eli, you should do the DAs first. And Eli was like, yeah, that makes sense. And then I just continued frontlining the shell while Eli came up with like we had nothing to the DAs in the entire 3 minutes of prep. So everything you heard in response to those like theory bad arguments was just off the top from Eli. So kudos to that. It was apparently enough. I'll take it.
So I suppose Sai isn't here to talk about the summary, but I guess I'll just talk about it additionally. So the summary kind of focused a lot on the theory bad shells. I think that the part on the theory of the shell itself, of whether or not paraphrasing is good or bad, kind of became subordinate to the rest of the debate over whether or not this is a good norm or not, which I think Roy already talked about, so I'm not going to talk about more. So I think Sai frontlines both these shells. Might have been a strategic decision that could have focused on just one of them, but I think both of them are also have arguments that could cross apply to the rest of the debate, right? Arguments about like how you can back channel or like message Eli after the round or something if you have questions about it, are things that could certainly apply to the first one about theory. So we see a lot of responses, Sai frontlines a lot of these, and then we extend the debate about access. And I think the main part of the summary was focusing a lot of these weighing mechanisms about what is most important impact in the round, how do we consider the quality of debate versus the quantity of people who can access the debate, and lots of resolution using these weighing mechanisms. I think, however, and then we finally go into one point in their argument. I think this might have been one problem with the round in like not covering the entire part of the flow, which let second summary cross apply some of the arguments that were made on the paraphrasing shell later on to the theory good/bad debate. But I think Roy can cover those parts. Finally, I think first summary also did a good job at identifying why a lot of the mitigatory stuff that Eli mentioned about you can message, you can use PF forward, you can look at the internet about this stuff might not be totally accessible, and our perception of whether or not it is or is not accessible is biased by who we are and our own experiences in debate. If you, for example, are very plugged into the national circuit, if you have a bunch of friends who read this nice website and send it over to you, someone who's just joining the national circuit, someone who's looking at theory for the first time, might not have that kind of connection, might not be able to access these sorts of resources as well as you could. And I don't mean you like you BCC or you me or you Sai. I just mean people who are thinking about whether or not these things make debate more or less accessible. Certainly they make it more accessible if they give people resources, but we also have to consider how people get those resources or who can get those resources or who is predisposed to access those resources, getting better at a theory debate and better than some people who might not have access. So I think a lot of the debate coming out of the second half was trying to focus on why the question of accessibility should act as a filter on all the questions of if debate is a good or bad activity, or if these are benefits or harms to debate, first questioning who those are benefits or harms to.
So I guess I'd go through second summary. We had no prep, and I had been writing front lines to the things Nathaniel had read on our shell while Eli was reading responses to the DAs they go for. So I really had no idea what was going on that side of the flow. So I spent at least 40 seconds weighing just like generally, and we'd also dropped a bunch of like prior question claims about how their DAs just fundamentally come before the shell. So, but what we did, or at least what I did in summary, was the weighing are all reasons why concepts like accessibility come before our shell. So I just linked the shell into accessibility, which isn't necessarily new weighing because I'm still agreeing that accessibility comes first, which is what we conceded, but I'm linking in and saying we're a better link. And I'm also kind of sort of addressing the idea that accessibility matters, or that, sorry, not that accessibility matters, right? Because we're still agreeing accessibility comes first, but that their accessibility has any impact. So our argument made in the top of the weighing after extensions was that access to debate absent theory is worthless. And that's kind of the argument we really go for in the final focus, but I'll talk about it a little more. So the example we read for this, the whole point of my summary was a little bit of like smoke and mirrors, as if the argument we're going for is paraphrasing is bad, when in reality, both sides had probably recognized that the better path of the ballot for us was theory is good, because that's the more undercovered ballot by size summary. So I make the argument that absent paraphrasing, or absent theory, there's paraphrasing, and paraphrasing is bad and destroys education. And the reason for that was so that Nathaniel would go up there and go, no, it probably doesn't destroy all fairness, yada, 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 which is what Nathaniel does. But the issue is the broader claim that's being made isn't that paraphrasing destroys all education and fairness, even though that's what I said in summary. The broader claim is on his side of the flow, which is that theory is necessary because otherwise there's infinite abuse. And the argument here is just absent theory, there is nothing that stops me from going up there and like, I don't know, reading whatever I want without a content warning, or reading whatever I want in whatever practice I want to. And I think that the fundamental failure of Nathaniel in Final Focus and of this summary, no offense to them, is that there is a very, very easy path to the ballot for my opponents, which is that paragraph theory solves all of the theory good arguments in a better way. And then it's just never articulated in the round. And also there's no defensive press as to what practices might destroy the activity, right? Like I can just assert that without theory, there's infinite abuse, but that's probably like not that true. There was no theory in public forum like 2 years ago, and it wasn't just infinite abuse, which is obviously a matter for debate. I think that paraphrasing is infinite abuse, but like whatever. So the point is, we were kind of just going for 2 avenues or 3 avenues, and I'll break this down in a way that's simpler and less of a rant. Win the shell, which was very easy because it was dropped. Weigh the shell against access in 2 forms. One is the link-in. We also link in access. And 2 is the only world where access matters is the world with theory, which is kind of getting into their case. And so we do that by referencing claims made in the shell about how it destroys all fairness because infinite arguments versus topic literature is an infinite disparity, or destroys all education because I don't learn shit from your evidence. I just learned that Nathaniel thinks that the Rice evidence says, and then on their case, instead of going for the arguments that get frontlined, all of their defense is mitigatory, right? All of the defense they read isn't PF forward cannot solve. It's PF forward is not large enough to solve. It's not accessible enough to solve. It's not widely, and so forth. And all of their arguments are like, these problems exist in the SQO. And so the argument we made is that they have conceded that accessibility is going up with the proliferation of theory. As more teams read theory, more resources are made available, more coaches are talking about it, and generally access permeates every round that might have the potential to have a theory discussion. And so we go for this, like, their world has no theory, has no value of access, has no value to education or anything like that. Our world has theory, and in the SQO, it might be accessible, but it is getting increasingly more accessible, which resolves their claims, and it is the only risk of anything good from the debate space, which is our claim. So I guess you could consider that trajectory analysis about how our defense is like long-term, but it's probably more weighing. And then the last thing is that I kind of tried to line by line their shells, but I didn't even know what they were really, because like Nathaniel's voice is really annoying. So I tuned those out. Just kidding. And so on the jargon one, the issue was I did the same thing that I think they should have done, which is just you don't specify what jargon is inaccessible. We didn't say RVI. We said they should not be able to garner offense on the theory layer, right? Like that's not jargon. There's no jargon in our things. Interpretation is not a jargon term. It's just a word. And so my response to that entire thing was just, they need to specify jargon. It's too late now. And on the other one, it was literally just the trajectory analysis. So instead of going for the line by line on these DAs and the comparative, it was just competing worlds. One with theory and one without paraphrasing, and one without theory and also without paraphrasing, with the like, our world is getting better, their world is static kind of analysis, if that makes any sense. It was kind of a ramble.
Great. So to cover the final focus, similar to the summary, a lot of the final focus focused on the broader ideas of access, and that's kind of how the speech starts out, by noticing the implicit biases that are inside this round, noticing like who participates in these theory discussions as a good example of how access is a precondition to what we discuss. And so a lot of the debate that Roy's talked about happening on these sorts of issues of is theory possible? Is norm setting possible? Can we improve the activity? The final focus tried to make it sort of subordinate to the question of who is accessing the activity, who is accessing these discussions of how we make the activity better. So I think we talked about in the speech how the examples that they identify are just exceptions to the barriers that people face to access theory. And of course, not only one, why paraphrase D was not gone. Is this paraphrase or paragraph?
Paragraph, my bad.
Paragraph? I think I already mentioned some stuff about how this is, I suppose, less of a applicable to what BCC did about like what exactly the structure of the argument was and how well it links into it. But I think I'm going to address this later on, or I guess what I was about to address it right now, is that I guess we kind of felt like this is less of an important discussion to have about theory, about like exactly how it's read. Like it might have been the most strategic thing to do in the speech. Like if we wanted to, like, I don't know, but it's not like the most important discussion that I thought should be had in a round where people are going to watch to learn about how theory is done, what kind of norms is theory setting, and like how theory is perceived by the community. I just thought it might be a better idea to talk about things that I thought were like much more important. Like I've made this first argument like many more times than I've ever made a paragraph theory argument, because I think it's like truly a thing that people writing theory have to consider, whereas the formatting of it is not as big of concern, maybe in this round, but not overall. So back to that idea is that the question of theory isn't necessarily like, this is also going back to something in second cross. It's not necessarily, are the arguments you're making for theory good, but who gets to make arguments for theory and what perspectives do they take into account with that theory? Like, for example, Eli's not here, but when Eli says, oh, you can just message me after the round, that is from the perspective of somebody who is the one getting messaged after the round, someone who has like a lot of clout on the national circuit and lots of people know their name and are willing to talk to them. However, for somebody who might come from like a very small program, someone who doesn't know a lot of people or doesn't debate a lot of the national circuit, these kinds of questions aren't really applicable to them or are much, much harder to consider from their perspective, which is why I think a lot of the theory debate comes in. So for example, the first weighing mechanism we talked about was why these are the most ignored, because they're not included in discussions of this because they're not in the activity period. And so a lot of the discussion about, oh, are there alternatives? An argument that was made earlier was about how we include perspectives on how to improve the activity. And so perhaps people who debate theory a lot might believe there are no alternatives to improving the activity other than theory, but and a perspective which is biased by their own participation in theory demo rounds, people who've done theory in the past, compared to people who are pushed out of an activity. If that activity predominantly uses theory, then they won't be included if their perspectives are different, or if their methods of changing the debate are different, if theory is seen to be an overriding norm. So that's one of the arguments that kind of could shape the rest of the round and could change it. Similarly, of course, we also have to consider the perspective of the round, which is kind of part of the beginning of the final focus, which is that we are in a demo round of theory. It's going to be pretty hard to prove that theory is necessarily a bad thing, which is why we have to check our biases of how we came into this round. Similarly, to have like people implicitly believe traditional debate is good, even if they are the ones who have done traditional debate, we will implicitly think that theory is good because it is a norm that we are all in this round used to. We are all selected because we have done theory debate in the past, because we know about theory, because we're comfortable debating theory, which makes us biased towards arguments that are like theory is great because of our perspectives. And so I think perspectives and how we include different perspectives are really important for how this round went about. And finally, on scope, talking about how the people, or rather the issues that we can talk about are maximized when we maximize the issues that we can talk about, because people who face different issues in debate and who get pushed out based on the question of access are unable to bring those issues up in debate because they are not participating based on that question of access. And so I think a lot of the debate, or a lot of the speech rather, focused on framing the round, focused on trying to frame out a lot of the arguments that the negs talked about why theory is good, or why it's important to talk about these issues of paraphrasing, for example, simply because they are not questioning who gets to talk about them in the first place. And then briefly, of course, some line by line and things that are in the second summary. And then at the bottom, just a question of like, who is the one who's determining whether or not things are good or bad in debate? When they make totalizing claims about, oh, we don't learn anything from debate, or everyone's going to quit debate, all of these are based in a perspective of someone who, as Roy said, is not a big fan of paraphrasing already and does not really enjoy paraphrasing as a practice. And from that, perhaps to someone who is anti-paraphrasing, a debate without paraphrasing might not be, or debate with paraphrasing might not be worth participating in at all. Yet, to the perspectives of many other people who have had many enjoyable paraphrasing debates, myself included, that is a perspective that should be included in these discussions as well. And so a lot of the debate kind of focused on the question of what discussion we are having in this theory round and how we can maximize the people who are included in that discussion, instead of necessarily saying, even if it comes at the cost of some people, our argument is correct, because the people who test if that argument is correct or not are not here. So that was the final focus.
So briefly, on the paragraph theory discussion that was had at the beginning of Nathaniel's chat, I think that the issue with it, as Nathaniel says, is that it's subject to too much of the defense from above. And the paragraph theory argument, it only has two net benefits: jargon, which they do go for and probably don't win, and the other, which doesn't get extended. But if we look back at the doc, the other is theory beyond what most teams consider to be the bounds of debate is much harder to understand in a rigid system new debaters haven't heard of. Which means that Nathaniel has to prove the distinction between like the shell we read and paragraph theory in terms of like it feeling new and like feeling weird, which is a really difficult claim to win. And so that net benefit, also like there's very little definitions of what paragraph theory is and so forth. So I just don't think it's fleshed out enough in the rebuttal speech for it to be a really viable like attack, absent jargon, which is really the only way that paragraph theory has like discernible, comprehensible offense. But we didn't read much jargon. Like we specifically avoided reading jargon because round 7 of the TOC, Gavin Sarah was like, don't read jargon in your shell. And we were like, I bet. So if that makes sense. For the rest of like for second final, we didn't have much prep, but like we were kind of talking about it on the doc. And so Nathaniel still drops in summary this analysis about the trajectory of defense. Like it's just clean conceded, or not summary, final focus. It's just clean conceded out of final focus. So they read their overview and we read ours. And our overview is literally just like this worlds comparison thing. And it doesn't directly engage with any of that implicit bias analysis, but the implicit bias analysis is like somewhat new, or at least poorly explained in summary. So we think we can probably get away with having just a stronger and clearer narrative, even if theirs is a prior question, and that would probably win us the debate. And then we just line by line their prior question analysis later. So the final focus starts with, they go for starts with extensions, and then like on their shell, it goes, they go for access, but they've conceded that access is fucking worthless without theory. And it just goes from there. And it basically just contends that in a world without theory, all of their net benefits cannot manifest because they'll be destroyed by bad practices and so forth. And so that analysis takes out every part of final focus and every part of the round prior, with the exception of the implicit biases discussion. So that's the purpose of that. And the only response we get to this idea of in a world without theory, it would just like in a world without theory, debate is meaningless. The only response we get to this is that like PF has flourished. But we just say that it's flourished because there's been theory, which is probably somewhat true, right? Like the time PF has massively expanded coincides with the time we've had theory. And also, even if that's not true, like PF is probably safer and more educational given theory, but that doesn't really address the claims that they're making. But in either world, the main defense we're going for on their arguments about accessibility are that accessibility is going up and more discussions and more dialogues and more perspectives are being had. And so that sort of addresses the implicit biases conversation, because it means that like we get more people with fewer or with I guess like disparate biases, but so it's an attempt to solve back against their argument, and it's literally just going for a world comparison. We are the only risk of offense on any improvement to this world whatsoever. Whereas they want to throw away the entire discussion because some people aren't included. And so one world has discussions, even if they're not optimal, and the other world has none at all. The only answer we get to this claim is that the world with no discussions is better than the world where discussions are arbitrated and run by like elitists, right? So Nathaniel's claim from here, and this is the way I think the round boils down. We say our world has discussion, their world doesn't. They say discussion is bad when it's purely done by the elitists, as verified by those discussions pushing people out of the activity. Our response to this is twofold. One, the discussion is broadening, and two, and more importantly, theory only affects people who are included in the discussion. The effects of theory, you cannot lose to a shell unless you also get the ability to participate with the shell. And so we make the like broad claim that it is easy and getting easier to lose to theory or engage with theory generally, and then stay in the activity and keep engaging. And the existence of resources and so forth means that even if PF Forward isn't accessible to people in rural communities or to local leagues and so forth and so on, it is accessible once you've been hit by theory. Once you've actually experienced this system, there are ways that you can include yourself into it. And one loss to theory that teaches you about like the epistemology of theory and the epistemology of debate and so forth, one loss does not outweigh having any discussion whatsoever insofar as we include those people. So if I was to break down this debate into two competing worldviews, it's not really about paraphrasing good or bad. It seems like it is, but that is like the lowest layer of the debate. The highest layer of the debate is theory, bad or good. And so if I were to break down the part of this debate that matters, our world has discussion, their world does not. They say discussion is bad because it doesn't include people. We say that it's including more people and that those who are hurt by it are thereby included, which means that their harms are temporary, our benefits are long-term. And I think that's why Will voted for us and why Nathaniel is a baboon.
Okay, cool. I guess really quickly to wrap up, just a really like general question for both of you. What do you think is like the easiest way to learn about theory and I guess get good at debating theory absent lots of resources and coaches?
This round.
I would say that trying to think about the theory debate yourself, a lot of theory arguments can be made analytically. I think I don't think the rebuttal that I read had any cards in it, and I think what you ought to do is just talk about some friends, meet some people that you know. Don't have to be so good at theory in the first place, but as long as you can have discussions of what things you do and why you do them. A lot of theory is discussing what impacts our practices have. If we paraphrase, what are the good things about paraphrasing? What are the bad things about paraphrasing? For example, as like an extreme example, why do we stay within speech times? Why doesn't everyone just give like a 5-minute rebuttal? Well, what are some harms of that? It might make some rounds unfair because people get more time to speak than others. It might make rounds pretty hard to engage in if times go way over time and tournaments can't hold such long rounds. You can think of all the harms that come when people engage in certain practices, and thinking about what practices you do and justifying them can then bring you to see when people don't follow the same practices you do. For example, if Roy and Eli don't paraphrase, then they think about why it is that they don't paraphrase. Why it is do they not cut, or why do they cut cards, and why do they read direct quotes off those cards? What are the differences between them and someone who does not? And those can become your theory arguments. So I think that, especially given the second argument that we make in rebuttal about paragraph theory, that theory does not have to be some strict thing with like paradigm issues or like interpretation, counter-interpretation. It can just be arguments that justify a practice, that justify why something is good, why something is bad, and if accessibly made, is certainly not something that you should stray away from. So, of course, that might be a little bit contradictory with the first one, but my main point is that as long as you can work very, very hard to think about how you can make your arguments equitably, to make them accessibly to anybody else, then it's certainly a good idea to make them, to make sure that people can understand how theory works and make sure people understand how norms are set best in debate. And you can best do that by doing it on your own with your friends or teammates.
I think that,
Sorry. Go ahead.
oh, sorry. To answer the question, I think Nathaniel's answer is obviously right. But also, like the idea of, I think that rather than trying to learn about theory, it's best to just try and sit there and come up with differences between the argumentation in theory and the argumentation in round. And if you literally sit there in your chair with like a shell in front of you and a case in front of you, or just trying to conceptualize the two forms of argumentation, theory and substance, and you try and come up with differences between the two, you will realize that there aren't any, with the exception of one being more analytical. And so trying to think through differences and come up with them for yourself is the best, because everyone goes, it's just another argument. It's just, come on, guys, it's a link impact, and it's, no one believes that. But if you sit there and use your full brain power, the thing you're so proud of, and try and come up with those differences, and then you can't, you will be forced to reconcile with the fact that theory is just another argument. And from there, you can proceed into your learning of theory by doing all the things Nathaniel suggests and watching this round and going on PF forward and yada, yada. But you can proceed into your learning with a more open mind and in less of a like baboonish complexion, conception. Okay, cool. Nathaniel?
Cool. So thanks for everyone for watching, and thank you to our debaters. We're going to be posting our theory lectures in next week, hopefully, and posted our identity by Sean and Anya. So make sure to watch that. And we will be having hopefully more debates for the break for case and theory. So make sure to keep up with it. If you have any questions, you can email or Instagram or resolve or any